Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Friday the 7th of July. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 499 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will take a look at today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. Ukrainian troops have advanced by more than a kilometre in the last day against Russian forces near the eastern city of Bakhmut, according to Sergei Cherevati, a military spokesperson. The US is about to announce a new Ukraine weapons aid package that will include cluster munitions. Human Rights Watch urged the US not to supply the cluster munitions to Ukraine and called on Moscow and Kyiv to stop using the controversial weapons. Transferring cluster bombs to Ukraine will inevitably cause long-term suffering for civilians, the group said. In Prague yesterday, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky admitted that Ukraine's counter-offensive was not fast, but Kyiv's troops were advancing. In a joint press conference with President Zelensky this morning, the Czech Prime Minister Piotr Fiala emphasized how much support his country has already given to Ukraine and committed to sending more military helicopters and to aid the training of pilots on F-16 fighter planes. The inaugural meeting of the new NATO-Ukraine Council, made up of the 31 NATO allies and Ukraine, will take place next week in Vilnius. In its latest update on the situation at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, the International Atomic Energy Agency writes, IAEA experts have received additional access to the site of Ukraine's Zaporizhia nuclear power plant without, so far, observing any visible indications of mines or explosives. It added that inspectors still need more access, including to the rooftops of reactor units 3 and 4 and parts of the turbine halls. Russia's security forces claim that they have detained a man in illegally annexed Crimea, accusing him of sabotaging the railways in the region on behalf of Ukrainian forces. Vyacheslav Gladkov, the governor of the Belgorod region in Russia, has said that one man was killed by Ukrainian shelling in the last 24 hours. Suspilny, Ukraine's state broadcaster, is reporting that Russia struck the right bank of the Dnipro River near the Antonivka road bridge overnight. In Kherson, 5 civilians were wounded. President Biden's administration did not sanction or support secret meetings that former top US national security officials held with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and other Russians on potential talks to end the Ukraine war, the White House and the State Department said yesterday. President Zelensky is visiting Turkey today for talks with the President Recep Tayyip Erdogan on the Black Sea grain deal and developments in the war in Ukraine. And Romania is reported to be considering opening a regional training hub for F-16 fighter jet pilots, which would ultimately be available to its NATO allies and partners, including Ukraine. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined this evening by a regular friend of the programme. William Duguid is an activist, a commentator and blogger, and he also helps to run the Perth and Kinross Yes Hub. William, good evening. How are you keeping?
I'm keeping just fine. How are you, Andrew?
I'm very well, thank you, and all the better for seeing you, William. It's a few months since you and I last spoke on Broadcasting Scotland, I think.
Yes, something like that. I've been on a few times, though.
Good. Well, our first item this evening is that a record 12.4% pay increase for junior doctors and doctors in training for 2023-24 has been agreed with the British Medical Association. Following discussions with Health Secretary Michael Matheson this afternoon, BMA Scotland has agreed to suspend strike action while they consult their members on this deal. Coupled with the pay rise of 4.5% awarded in 2022-23, this amounts to a cumulative increase of 17.5% over 2 years. The deal also includes a commitment to future years' pay, contract and pay bargaining modernisation. The Health Secretary Michael Matheson said, following months of negotiations with BMA Scotland, I am delighted that we've agreed a pay deal for 2023-24 for our junior doctors. BMA has agreed to suspend strike action in Scotland while they consult with their members. He went on, I hope this investment and the significant commitments we have given around pay and contract reform will show junior doctors how much we value them and that we are determined to ensure that Scotland is the place for junior doctors to work and train. He went on, some patients may have been contacted to say their treatment has been cancelled. We are working hard with health boards to make sure appointments that can go ahead do, and that any others are rescheduled as soon as possible. So, William, Dr. Chris Smith, who's the Scottish Junior Doctors Committee chair, said, by agreeing to address the way our pay has been cut and setting out a clear mechanism for doing so, the government is making a serious, welcome commitment to ensuring that pay for junior doctors in Scotland is restored to a fair level. So do you think, is that a key to the approach that's been taken from Holyrood, by which I mean sit down, negotiate seriously and find a way forward, rather than do little more than attack doctors and other key workers from the front pages of the Mail, the Telegraph and the Spectator?
Well, the two approaches certainly seem to be chalk and cheese. And I think that certainly it seems that we're going to continue the record that the Scottish Government has got of not having strikes in the health service, whereas in England there have been strikes on just about every level. So that's clearly a plus. So I think that we're not out of the woods yet, because obviously they could turn down this offer. But at the same time, I think this is fairly positive talk from Chris Smith, and he seems to recognise that it's the best deal that can be reached in the circumstances. And I think that's certainly a positive way forward. So let's hope that the vote goes the right way next week.
Thanks, William. Now, you said we're not out of the woods yet, and that's both in the short term, as you say. The doctors have not yet been polled on what they would like to do, and I was thinking also in the slightly longer term. Now, the BMA Scotland says the deal represents an improvement on the previous offer and that it gives a genuinely credible and workable pathway towards pay restoration. Coupled with pay rise from 4.5% last year, this amounts to a cumulative increase of 17.5% over 2 years. Now, it strikes me that that is perhaps about 8% short of actual pay restoration, at least according to the doctors who were saying they reckoned that their pay had dropped by about 25%. So if there's still a gap, do you think is this an issue that's going to come back again?
I think it probably will. But what we need to do is just do what we can in the circumstances. And restoring pay in full, the way it's been cut in the last 15 years, will take time. And this is an inflation-busting increase, so it's an increase in real terms, and it's a great start. And it's the key is cooperation here. There's a degree of cooperation here that doesn't exist in the English talks, and that is down to, I think, the different approach the Scottish Government is taking.
Thanks, William. Certainly, I'm sure we'll come back to the story as the vote by the junior doctors is revealed next week, and we see where we get to next. But that sounds like positive news this afternoon, as you say. We'll move on now, because decriminalisation of all drugs for personal supply is one of a number of policies which the Scottish Government is calling on the UK Government to implement in a new paper on drug law reform. The move would allow people found in possession of drugs to be treated and supported rather than criminalised and excluded. Decriminalisation would also mean that without a criminal record, people in recovery would have a better chance of employment. The document has been published by the Scottish Government, outlining measures which could be implemented through further devolution, independence, or changes enacted immediately by the UK Government to support the work being done within existing powers to reduce drug deaths. Among the proposals are the decriminalisation for all drugs for personal supply, progressed as part of a wider review of drugs law, immediate legislative changes to allow us to fully and properly implement harm reduction measures, such as supervised drug consumption facilities, rather than the current proposal being explored, which is constrained by having to work within existing legislation, drug checking, and increased access to the life-saving drug naloxone, and also a roadmap for further exploration of drug law reform focused on evidence and the reduction of harm, including an update of the drug classification system to be based on harms caused. The proposals follow recommendations made by the Drugs Death Task Force in September 2021. The Minister for Drugs Policy, Elena Whitham, said, "These are ambitious and radical proposals, grounded in evidence that will help save lives. We want to create a society where problematic drug use is treated as a health, not a criminal matter, reducing stigma and discrimination and enabling the person to recover and contribute positively to society." While we know these proposals will spark debate, they are in line with our public health approach and would further our national mission to improve and save lives. She went on, "We are working hard within the powers we have to reduce drug deaths, and while there is more we need to do, our approach is simply at odds with the Westminster legislation we must operate within. Scotland needs a caring, compassionate and human rights informed drugs policy with public health and reduction of harm as its underlying principles, and we are ready to work with the UK Government to put into practice this progressive policy." So, William, firstly, the Scottish Government document is entitled "A Caring, Compassionate and Human Rights Informed Drug Policy for Scotland." And it struck me that each of the component parts of that title run counter to long-standing Westminster dogma, don't they?
Yes, they do, and that would be one of the reasons why what the Scottish Government has had to say has been slammed already by Rishi Sunak and also by certain Labour spokespeople. But it's an approach that works elsewhere and has been demonstrated to work elsewhere. So it's something that needs to be tried because what we've been doing up till now has not succeeded. Under the constraints that drug policy is under through Westminster, we are still the worst drugs problem in really this part of the world, the developed world, I would say. And we need to do something different. This is something different, and it has antecedents in other countries. And I very much hope that it's given an opportunity to show what it can do.
Thanks, William. I think you're right in saying that formal, or at least Tory policy on drugs remains abstention, which sounds decidedly 19th century, frankly. But following on from the point you were making, the Violence Reduction Unit approach, by which I mean coordinated agencies and a public health-based approach, not a criminal justice-based approach, has worked demonstrably and successfully. Violent crime has not been lower in Scotland since records began. The murder rate is less than half of what it was when I was taught criminal law. So why do you think there is resistance in Westminster and in Scottish Tory HQ, and as you say, the British Labour in Scotland's HQ as well, to a public health-led approach which we know works?
I really don't completely understand it because it's not as if the rest of the UK is doing great, and we may be doing worse. But the rest of the UK has a pretty grim record in terms of drugs deaths. So it just seems to be the dog whistle to the electorate again. The core Tory electorate and also the vote that Labour is chasing believe in the criminal justice approach, even though it's not. It demonstrably isn't a way of fixing the problem, but just of perpetuating it and possibly even complicating it still further. So drugs are reserved and we have very little room for maneuver here, but it would be really good if we could just be given the chance to do something different that has worked elsewhere and see what that does.
Thanks, William. As you imply, that if the so-called war on drugs was an actual war, we would have sued for peace decades ago, because it has been lost. There is no question. But let's move on now, because the number of households who were cut off from gas and electricity this winter because they did not have enough money to top up their prepayment meters has risen sharply. For electricity, the number of customers with smart prepayment meters, PPMs, whose supply was cut off, known somewhat confusingly in this way as self-disconnection, at least once for more than 3 hours, increased by 25% in the first 3 months of 2023, according to data released by the energy regulator Ofgem. For gas, there was a 13% increase. About half of all prepay customers have smart meters, with Ofgem data providing a good proxy for customers struggling to pay for their gas and electricity supplies. Peter Smith, the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the fuel poverty charity National Energy Action, said the impact of the energy crisis was still being felt across the UK. Analysts suggest the number of gas self-disconnections is higher because government help provided during the cost of living crisis, such as the £400 energy bill discount, was normally credited to the electricity meter. Because gas accounts did not have the same financial support, the number of self-disconnections is seen to be a more accurate reflection of the affordability pressures. Ofgem cut the price cap on gas and electricity to £2,074 for a typical household at the start of this month, although most households will feel little relief as the UK government has withdrawn universal support for energy bills. In addition to the £400 credit given to bill payers, the energy price guarantee, which temporarily replaced the price cap, limited average energy costs to £2,500, but both of those schemes has now ended. So, William, the numbers of people self-disconnecting, i.e. unable to pay their bills through smart meters, is going up in the middle of summer. What do you think is going to happen when the nights properly start drawing in and the mercury starts to drop?
Well, it will depend what sort of cold weather we have in the winter, but it will not be good, that's for sure. Things are relatively propitious at the moment, and yet the disconnections are going up. I really hate the term self-disconnection. It's this sort of euphemistic nonsense for basically leaving people in dire straits when they most need your services. And I think the conversion of prepayment meters to smart meters in this context is just a means of loading on the pain. So it's a highly unsympathetic approach we're seeing. And with the additional cost of living pressure that households are going to have over the next year, I can see nothing but trouble unless we have an unexpectedly mild winter. And that really shouldn't be happening in a country that sees itself as still, despite everything, one of the richest countries in the world.
That's a very good point that you make, William. Peter Smith, who I mentioned in the report there, said it is not surprising that self-disconnections are rising, but that does not make it any less worrying. He said prepayment meter customers are often some of the most vulnerable. They are often laden with debts and left with no choice but to ration their energy use. And is that not the key thing here? If it was only energy prices, then that might in some way be manageable. But of course it's not. Rent is going up, mortgage costs are going up, food and other essentials are all skyrocketing. So when families are surrounded by so many financial challenges all at the same time, that's a recipe for some really serious problems, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And you not only do you have problems with debt and with no access to energy if it's cut off from under your feet, but you've also got the strains on households and on household members and mental health strains, which really shouldn't be putting people through this. Um, the root cause of this is a dysfunction in the energy market, which actually we should fix long term. And we know some of the ways in which it can be done, pricing energy according to renewables, for example, or at least according to the way in which each piece of energy is produced. Instead, it's all costed according to oil and gas. But we also need to do something about the cost of living crisis, and it's not helping that the interest rates are going through the roof either. It's like an assault from all sides on the most vulnerable, and it's always the most vulnerable that feel it.
Absolutely, William. And I'm confident that I'm afraid to say that you and I will be discussing this story again as the nights draw in and as the mercury drops. But we'll move on now because a National Audit Office report has criticised the Department of Work and Pensions over material fraud and error after official figures revealed that benefit claimants were being underpaid by £3.3 billion last year. And that's the highest level on record. The DWP's annual report and accounts for 2022-23 also disclosed that the national insurance records for 10 million people claiming universal credit have not been updated properly. The Department for Work and Pensions also admitted that as many as 330,000 people, some of whom have since died, may have missed out on as much as £1.5 billion of valuable state pension entitlement, a disclosure that prompted some commentators to warn of a new scandal. The disclosures prompted the National Audit Office to announce it had once again qualified the department's accounts, meaning money has not been spent as it should have been. The NAO said this is the 35th year in which the DWP's accounts have been qualified due to material. One of the headline findings was that the estimated amounts of benefits underpaid by the department climbed in 2022-23 to 1.4% of the total, £3.3 billion, which, as I say, was a record high. This was up from 1.2% or £2.6 billion the previous year. The figures cover a range of benefits from universal credit to pensions. The personal independence payment, which helps people dealing with the extra living costs caused by long-term disability or ill health, is the benefit with the highest underpayment rate. This has been a long-running issue involving different categories of people being underpaid their state pension. In March this year, the DWP revealed that 46,000 affected pensioners had already been repaid a total of £300 million. The annual report gives full details for the first time on how a new group lost out: parents who were entitled to child benefit more than 2 decades ago. This issue affects people who received child benefit before 2000 and whose national insurance record was not updated to reflect periods of home responsibilities protection, a scheme that was scrapped in 2010 but to which they were entitled. The DWP estimates that 210,000 people, mainly women, fall into this category and receive too little, and that the total amount of state pension they missed out on was about £1.3 billion, though these estimates were described as uncertain and the final numbers could be larger or smaller. The department gave a range of between 120,000 and 330,000 people for those affected, and between £310 million and £1.5 billion for the amount it would have to repay. The average underpayment is thought to be about £2,000, but some have missed out on as much as £33,000. Commenting, the SNP spokesperson for Social Justice, David Linden MP, said the nonchalant attitude of the Department of Work and Pensions to accurately pay claimants and pensioners the money they are due is deeply insulting to all those that rely on the payments. So, William, first, the DWP said, we treat underpayment seriously and always look to ensure individuals receive the correct level of payment, adding claimants have a duty to report their circumstances correctly. So it's all the claimant's fault, is it? Why would you think would claimants be nervous about approaching the DWP after 14 years of brutal Tory austerity and the frankly inhumanity which was introduced into the social security system?
Yes, I wouldn't call it nonchalant. I would call it inhumane. And a properly functioning welfare system has to be humane. As I think the aspects that have been devolved to the Scottish Government, I think the treatment there is a lot more in line with what you would expect to see. And there are weasel words such as claimant error being behind the PIP shortages, in that people aren't reporting their circumstances correctly. There should be proactive ways through the health service of circumstances being reported accurately, because why should people be expected to go through the hassle of this hostile environment in order to get the right figure, knowing that if they make a mistake, they'll be clobbered? You can't have that. And that's part of the reason why we've got this 35-year scandal of underpayment and the accounts being qualified. I don't know if they're 35 consecutive years, I suspect they are, but they're deeply impressive, at least in a very, very dark way. The whole thing needs to be rethought, and I'm hoping that Scotland, as it takes on more welfare parts, will lead the way and be a bit of a beacon, although the attitude change required in the DWP is possibly beyond repair.
That's a very good point, William. Thank you. Now, the estimated £4.8 billion cost of HS2's endangered Euston Terminus could balloon further unless the government becomes clear what it is trying to achieve, the Public Accounts Committee has warned. In a highly critical report, MPs on the committee said the Department for Transport was yet to establish the design and expectations for the station against what it was willing to spend, despite 8 years of planning and designing. The original 11-platform plan was scaled back and original designs abandoned after a review of the high-speed rail network's costs in 2020, but they still far exceed the £2.6 billion budget. The Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, paused construction of the Euston site, along with other parts of HS2 in March this year, as the estimates surged. Yet the committee found the government did not know how much additional cost that decision would entail, nor the impact on the local area. Under the latest plans, high-speed trains will actually terminate at a new Oak Old Common interchange with Crossrail in West London when they start operating from Birmingham. Services will only come into Euston if and when the HS2 reaches Manchester in 2040. The committee also questioned the accuracy of Ministers' 6 monthly updates to Parliament. It noted that the potential overspend at Euston was put at £400 million in October 2020, a sum that was not altered in subsequent updates through to October 2022, despite proving less than 20% of the figure the National Audit Office reported 5 months later in March. The committee called on the Department for Transport to provide greater transparency to its calculations. MPs also raised questions about how the government would manage high levels of inflation after its inquiry was told of 30 to 40% swings in the cost of raw materials. The committee's chair, Meg Hillier, said the HS2 Euston project is floundering. This is a multi-billion-pound scheme which has already caused major disruption to the local community, but has now been put on pause. So, William, firstly, if my memory serves me well, the Queensferry crossing, which is about 2 miles that way, cost £1.3 billion, and actually the project saved about £245 million at the same time. So how can a single station in London cost more than £4 billion? Where is the money going?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, no doubt it's all very elaborate and brilliant, like all of these things are always set out to be, except that the really the government doesn't seem to know what it's doing and what the consequences of the pause are going to be. So you do kind of question really what these plans are like. I think the Queensferry crossing, although it was a good example of what can be done, is a little bit of an outlier because public procurement throughout the UK has got problems, and particularly big infrastructure projects. And nothing really comes significantly bigger than HS2 appears to be in England. And how high this will go, and eventually what it will take just to get something that works within our lifetimes, for goodness sake, does make you question what was the value of it in the first place, and would we have just been better increasing the efficiency of the rail network without a big project, but actually locally, and seeing what we could do to relieve pressure points, etc., etc. It's it's a mess, and one can only watch on and look at and eat one's popcorn. But we should learn lessons about what not to do in Scotland as well, and that's very important because we're going to have a lot of work to do after independence.
That's a very good point, William. The Public Accounts Committee says that the government is not clear what it is trying to achieve with the Euston terminus. Is it not clear that they're trying to build a station? I've checked. There are 334 train stations and 270 tube stations in Greater London. Would they not possibly give the government a clue as to what you are trying to achieve when you're building a station?
Yeah, well, you never know because very often governments seem to know better than experts in the actual industry, and maybe this is a case of that. I'm sure they want to build the best station ever, but they might not know what that entails.
Well, as you say, we'll continue to eat the popcorn and come back. And as you say, we also need to be learning lessons for the level of infrastructure investment that will be required in an independent Scotland. But thanks, William. Now then, the latest HMRC figures show that for the year ending in March 2023, Scotland's international trade in goods increased by more than 21%, compared to just a little over 17% for the UK as a whole. The key figures are, when comparing the value of exports in the year ending March 2023 with the year ending March 2022, the value of Scotland's international goods exports increased by 21.6%. In comparison, international goods exports from the UK increased by 17.5%. When oil and gas are excluded from these figures, the value of Scotland's international goods exports saw an increase of 17.7%, compared to 13.5% increase for the UK. The value of Scotland's goods exports to the EU increased by 23.7%, but when oil and gas are excluded, those exports to the EU increased by 8.5%. The value of Scotland's goods exports to non-EU countries increased by 18.6%, and when oil and gas is excluded from those figures, Scotland's goods exports to non-EU countries increased by 24.7%. The Netherlands remains Scotland's top destination for goods exports in the year, but when oil and gas are excluded, the USA emerged as the top export destination for goods exports, with France the second largest destination. The value of Scotland's goods imports increased by just over a quarter, up 26.8%, and an important contributor to that was the import of gas. And total trade, imports and exports, increased by 24.1%. The value of goods trade with EU countries rose by 28.3%, and goods trades with non-EU countries 20.7%. The portion of these statistics are presented without oil and gas due to the high volatility in the data, and of course in Scotland oil and gas account for a large proportion of the exports. It's also worth bearing in mind that the data covers the coronavirus pandemic and the first 27 months of trade following our UK's exit from the EU. So these are all provisional estimates which may have to be revised in the future. So, William, firstly, given the absolute disdain, or perhaps contempt is a better word, which a post-Thatcherite Westminster and its inhabitants apparently has for manufacturing and trade, do you think that there's a risk that they will start to do more to inhibit or restrict Scotland's trade when they see the growth in these figures?
Well, they might want to cling on to us all the more if we're doing that well. I mean, the main lesson to be learned from all the brickbats thrown at Scotland is, in fact, the rest of the UK wants to keep us because we are valuable to them in so many ways. And these figures, which are encouraging and show increases following, I think, probably a bit of a slowdown at the time of the COVID pandemic in year one, if you like, um, show Scotland holding its own, and that's very important. We need to keep uh, putting forth the argument that we can do this. If you look at Believe in Scotland, Scotland the Brief, you will see what resources Scotland has got, and this is an indication of what Scotland's businesses can achieve. And of course, with the focus now on innovation that we've seen lately from the government and on trying to strengthen those trade links, I think we can do well under independence in a way that people will be surprised about. And that's one of the things we should be driving home when we're on the street stall and people are dropping by saying, no, you can't do it. And I don't like that, Hamza Yusuf, because there's a lot there. The figures are a lot to take in, to be honest. And I can't explain why some of them are the best destinations, but it's a good set of figures. And let's hope they can keep it up and improve on it.
Thanks, William. Well, I was actually I'm going to ask you to speculate anyway, because as I said, when oil and gas are excluded, the USA is the top export destination and France is the second largest destination. So what do you think is it that our friends in the USA and our cousins in France are buying from Scotland?
Well, maybe it's whiskey. Certainly the USA might be quite keen on whiskey because theirs is basically rubbish. And so something better from abroad would be a good thing. France is a wee bit snobbier about drink, so I'm not quite so sure what gets you in there, but I'm sure it's the old alliance at work.
I think you're probably right, although France is quite a big market for whiskey. If I can't remember the numbers, but they do like a dram. But thank you, William. And we'll move on now because this week a report by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, gave a positive assessment of Japan's plans to pump more than 1 million tons of water from the wrecked Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant into the ocean. However, those proposals have failed to placate opponents. China remains fiercely opposed to the plans, while the support of the South Korea government has failed to quell widespread public opposition to the idea in that country. Today, the government in Seoul said that it respected the IAEA's review of plans by Japan and the plant's operator, Tokyo Electric Power, TEPCO, to pump water from the plant into the Pacific over the next 30 to 40 years. It said that the discharge would have negligible consequences for South Korea, but this was in an attempt to win over a deeply sceptical public. However, South Korea's ban on food and seafood from the Fukushima region will remain in place. China has today announced a ban on food imports from 10 of Japan's prefectures over safety concerns and said it would conduct stringent radiation tests on food from the rest of the country. The IAEA review brought Japan closer to the start of a long operation to pump water, a mixture of groundwater, rain, and water used for cooling damaged nuclear fuel, into the ocean, with reports suggesting it will begin in August. About 1.3 million tonnes of water stored in huge tanks on the site has been filtered through TEPCO's advanced liquid processing system to remove most radioactive elements, except for tritium, an isotope of hydrogen that is very difficult to separate from water. The treated water will be diluted with seawater, so the concentration of tritium should be well below internationally approved levels, before being released into the ocean 1 kilometre from the shoreline via an undersea duct. The water became contaminated after being used to cool fuel rods that melted after the plant was hit by a powerful earthquake and tsunami in March 2011, which triggered a triple meltdown of the Fukushima nuclear power plant. So, William, firstly, the politics of this opposition in that part of the world to this plan is all political, isn't it? It sounds like Korea and China are behaving a little bit like Alistair Jack does in the UK.
Possibly. China, of course, has it likes to get into perhaps using its muscle a little bit more and more as it becomes more influential in the world. And I dare say this is a wee bit of its own testing of the waters. There is a degree of hypocrisy, I think, in the opposition that we're seeing, in that both South Korea and China have got higher levels of nuclear type pollution going into the water than is contemplated from Fukushima. So, assuming that the international standards are correctly and based on science and correctly put together, then it seems that what's being proposed probably is within the bounds of what you would call safe. I hesitate to go too far in that regard because I honestly think that the nuclear issue is a big one, and we don't totally understand the long-term effects of anything. So I would give a sort of qualified approval, perhaps more qualified than the IAEA is giving, but nevertheless a qualified one. But certainly hypocrisy in the response from China in particular, I think.
Thank you, William. And bringing it back to Scotland for a moment, I wonder whether Andrew Bowie MP is keeping abreast of these developments. He's now the Nuclear Energy Minister, and the UK government has reportedly abandoned efforts to force Scotland to accept more nuclear power plants. Bowie has said that Westminster is not engaging in a fight with the Scottish government over its long-held stance against nuclear power. Now, the West Aberdeenshire and Kincardine MP has insisted that nuclear power is safe in an interview with the Herald. Do you think, has Andrew Bowie ever heard of Fukushima?
Nuclear power is safe until it's not. And safety arrangements are working until they're not. And you just don't know what the future holds. And the downside risk is just too great. I think the Westminster government will not have a fight with Scotland over issues on which it might lose in terms of public opinion. And I think the nuclear thing is one of them. There are other battlegrounds they're choosing which are likely to be far more successful for them, where public opinion is not necessarily with the Scottish government. And perhaps Andrew Bowie is reflecting on that a little bit and just choosing his battles.
Thank you, William. Now then, we'll take a little bit longer this evening to have a look at a significant political event in Scotland, because the SNP has marked the milestone of 100 days since Humza Yousaf was first sworn in as First Minister, and they've published a list of actions and initiatives undertaken by the new administration. I'll list those actions and initiatives, and then William and I will discuss a number of aspects with regard to the first 100 days of Humza Yousaf's time in office as our First Minister. In the first 100 days, the government has delivered a series of measures, including tripling the Fuel Insecurity Fund from £10 million to £30 million next year, announcing £15 million funding for free after-school and holiday clubs across Scotland, awarded £15 million to a range of projects supporting people affected by problem substance use, £25 million investment to support the North East's just transition, £1 million of support for GP practices to help tackle health inequalities. But they've published the first annual report on tackling child poverty delivery plan. There's a new national strategy backed by £2 million of investment this year to help cut violent crime further and to reduce the harm it causes. There's been a cross-party summit on tackling poverty and inequality in Scotland. There's a new cancer strategy as well as a new refreshed stroke improvement plan. Emergency measures to protect tenants during the cost of living crisis will be extended. Signing the Verity House agreement with COSLA, which is a transformative new deal for local government in Scotland. Providing funding to help Scotland's food and drink sector grow sustainably over the next 5 years. Establishing the New Deal for Business Group to deepen links with the private sector, and setting out the Scottish Government's plans for a written constitution in an independent Scotland. Marking the milestone, Scotland's Deputy First Minister, Shona Robeson MSP, said the first 100 days of Humza Yousaf's administration has seen rapid delivery of areas that matter to people in Scotland. We are putting people's needs at the heart of everything the Scottish Government does, not least supporting struggling families during the cost of living crisis. Against the backdrop of the damage done by Brexit and cuts from Westminster, the Scottish Government is delivering meaningful support to those most hard-pressed and investing in our public services. So, William, perhaps inevitably we will look at the first 100 days a little bit from the perspective of the Nicola Sturgeon era, because that's the most immediate comparison. However, I'm sure that you and I will go much further than just that. And also, I think it's fair to reflect that some critics of the First Minister would say that perhaps his greatest achievement in his first 100 days as First Minister is that he is still First Minister after the 100 days that he has endured. And thinking about that for a moment, I think you and I have probably spoken about this before. Is it perhaps the case that this particular job of First Minister in Scotland is perhaps too big and too complex? You're leading a political party, you're leading the country, and also now you're first activist, as Humza Yousaf described his intention. Is it possible for one person to do all of those things at the same time?
Well, I think it wouldn't be possible for one person to do all of these things, but it's important how the team works. I think one potential criticism of the Nicola Sturgeon administration was that too much was being done within an inner circle that didn't really reach out to other people, both within the party and in the movement. I think that perhaps has led to some of the difficulties that they currently find themselves in, although we don't know where these will go. I do get the impression that Humza Yousaf is more of a collegiate leader, just on the basis of what I've seen in those first 100 days. And I think that will stand him in good stead. A lot of the difficulties he's been experiencing have not been of his making, and he's having, in a sense, to make the best of them. So there's quite a lot in the list of steady as she goes stuff and slight improvements in terms of the funding of initiatives, and that's all very important. But what's also important is the overall look of the government, and it's got a lot of public scepticism to overcome because of the difficulties the SNP is finding itself in. And what will be key to Humza continuing to be First Minister will be making progress on some of the bigger issues and also establishing, in a sense, his own space as a leader so that he's not just the follow-on from Nicola Sturgeon. I think he's made a decent start, but there's a long way to go.
That's a very good way of putting it, William. Thank you. I'll test that a little bit by asking whether, and we know at the time of his election, that some commentators characterised Mr. Yousaf as being the continuity candidate and as Miss Sturgeon's man. So we'll test that a little bit by looking at it from both directions, if we may. Do you think, on the one hand, is he perhaps demonstrating that he is still or is Miss Sturgeon's man, especially after refusing to suspend Nicola Sturgeon from the SNP when she was arrested?
Well, not suspending her was consistent with the other decisions that he made in the case of Peter Murrow and Colin Beattie. And it's you could argue that previously, when people were suspended for just being accused of things effectively before any charges are being laid, that was a little bit on the harsh side. It's a difficult balance to fulfill, but he can certainly say he's been consistent. What will be interesting is if Operation Branchform comes to anything and there are charges, and what he does then, because it's at that time that he's really going to need to show that the SNP is holding up strongly there and not necessarily just condoning things that might have gone wrong. We're not there yet, but I think he's been a good continuity candidate, but I do think he is more than that, and I think he may have to show that as the next weeks and months unfold.
Thank you, William. Well, that's the next thing that's the next perspective I was going to use to test this a little bit as to whether he's not Miss Sturgeon's man, because when he announced his cabinet, he said he had committed himself to a radical, ambitious, and progressive policy agenda for Scotland, and he said that he knew that his cabinet was the right one to deliver it. But as we know, the National Care Service legislation is delayed, the deposit return scheme is suspended, the ban on alcohol advertising has been stopped. Highly protected marine areas have in the context in which they were consulted upon have also been stopped. So, do you think is it the case that Mr. Yousaf will feel that he's acted decisively to remove some of the more controversial is a word that's far overused nowadays, but to remove some of the items left in his in tray by Ms. Sturgeon? And is it the case that comprehensive changes have been made to his government's agenda in what is quite a short space of time?
I think some of the dropping of or delaying of certain measures that were not popular um, is pragmatic and very sensible, because what Hamza Yusuf does not want to be doing is fighting on grounds where he doesn't actually have all that much support, even within the party sometimes, but certainly in the Scottish public. I do think also that the HPMA, not in its current form decision, was based on a consultation. And that is a good sign of listening to the consultation. Um, Consultations, they're not quite 10 a penny, but they're quite frequent, have been from the Scottish Government in recent years. And folk like Commonweal will tell you that very often the government seems to be sort of shoving the consultation in a particular way and not necessarily listening to the outcome. With HPMA, it's different, and I think that might be significant and a good sign. The Scottish Government needs to be listening, the SNP needs to be listening to its members, and the government needs to be listening to the people, and to fight on the grounds, because there will be plenty of grounds to be fought on, where they will get support.
Thank you, William. That's a very good point and a very good distinguisher with regard, in particular, to the approach that was taken for HPMAs. Thinking of coming back to the politics and the change in emphasis and the change in approach, perhaps, it struck me that Hamza Yousaf's speech at the convention in Dundee a couple of weeks ago was a speech that was, in lots of ways, very different from the Sturgeon era. Firstly, he was heckled, and we don't see a great deal of that for the party leader. And secondly, when he was heckled, he immediately came down off the stage and went and spoke to the woman who was shouting at him from the back of the hall. Now, I don't think we would have seen that during the Sturgeon era. Does this indicate that times have changed?
I think it might have. One of the things the SNP needs to do, not just to listen to its own members, but to reach out now to the independence movement. People have been crying out to that for a while. And listening when people are trying to get your attention. I mean, the heckler might be an extreme example, but certainly that was an unusual and very much welcomed in the hall reaction to it. He got some pelters for it outside of the independence movement from, if you like, the usual suspects. But nevertheless, I think that was a very courageous thing to do. I don't know if he did it, must have done it in the spur of the moment, but I think he got a lot of credit from his own membership about that, and I think possibly also from the movement. So Yeah, I think he will prove over time to be different, and he will develop if he's allowed to, and if circumstances allow him to, because it's always circumstances, dear boy. We don't know what's round the corner, but I think there's definitely grounds for good expectations there.
That's a good point. Thanks, William. And we'll not quote Harold Macmillan accurately with that quotation because there's a swear word in the middle of it, I believe. But that's
Oh,
a very good point. Thank you. One aspect of one continuity aspect perhaps is the continuation of the Butte House agreement with the Greens. And some say that that was underlined when Humza Yousaf stood up in the chamber to defend Lorna Slater from a confidence vote that was tabled by the Scottish Tories. Now, that may have helped smooth over the fact that several totems of the Butte House agreement, like HBMAs, have either been ditched or paused. And to your point about reaching out to the independence movement, the Greens, I suspect, also hope to wield influence from within that big indie tent that Humza Yousaf seems determined to erect. So do you think we're going to see a continuation or an expansion of that inclusive approach, and also a continuation of both either the words or the intent of the Butte House Agreement with the Green Party?
yes, I think so. Although, yeah, it might be tempered by pragmatism as it has been. But one of the things that Humza Yousaf can ill afford is for the Greens to basically walk away from the government. At this early stage, that would be a crushing blow. He might find later on in the parliament that he's a wee bit stronger and he's got better ground. But in any event, because really he depends on them for the majority, I think he's going to be pragmatic about that all the way through. And it's a difficult relationship. It's not an automatic thing that the SNP and the Greens can work effectively together. And there may be some tensions there, but at the moment they seem to be hiding themselves reasonably well.
Thank you, William. We'll look to the future now in two ways. Firstly, from the perspective of the party, and then from the perspective of the government. Firstly, from the party, I'm thinking forwards to the SNP conference in the autumn, where Mr. Yousaf said he will bring forward the results of a review into party governance, as well as a finalised independence strategy. With regard to the party, how difficult do you think it will be to review the governance of the party after such a long era of salmon, sturgeon, and mural management of the SNP?
I think it might be quite difficult, and it might be subject to things that he can't yet predict. So I think as long as he makes a start on it, that will be okay. The main thing is the here and now, and whether the members feel that they're being listened to now, because I suspect from what I'm listening to in the Perth Hub and elsewhere, a lot of them haven't felt that. So just progress on that will be good enough, I think. And hopefully those circumstances, with whatever word is attached, will not derail too many things before the autumn. Before, of course, the autumn, there's the regional assemblies, which will be talking about the independence package, and they will be important too, because that is a proper opportunity to listen to the members who I think are slightly ahead of the party, certainly the party under Nicola Sturgeon, and the opportunity to listen about what they see as the priorities and how to work them through. So good luck with those folks.
Thanks, William. And finally, thinking of the Scottish Government, the First Minister pledged that future government spending will target help for the poorest in our society in Scotland. There was a cross-party group to discuss how the government should tackle poverty. He tripled the Fuel Insecurity Fund to £30 million to help with high energy bills. He confirmed a further £1.3 billion investment in the Scottish Child Payment. And he said the government has also provided £15 million for families to benefit from free school-age care. But there is recently the suggestion that he's reining back his universalist approach to free school meals, partially informed by the £1 billion black hole that's predicted in Scottish Government finances for next year. But other aims to save Scots money include the 6-month pilot to scrap peak rail fares and, of course, the current rent cap, which has been extended until next year, which means that most rents can only rise by 3% a year. So this focus on helping the poorest in our society and tackling poverty. Do you think that's the big plan, the totemic policy that Hamza Yusuf is going to pursue, and how do you think the start to that policy has gone over the past 100 days?
Well, I mean, there were aspects of it already in existence in terms of the Scottish Child Payment, etc. Um, the figures involved are necessarily very small. There's only so much that can be done, and it's a laudable aim to support the poorest in society. But if you actually don't have and can't get hold of the funds to achieve that because of the constraints under which you operate, then there will inevitably be some pressure, and of course the pressure will be applied quite dishonestly by the unionist parties who, if they were in power, would not necessarily be doing any better. So I think he will have his work cut out, and I think it might be working around the edges a bit. And he's going to increasingly, as I believe he is doing, put the case that the only way this can properly be done is, you've guessed it, with the full powers of independence. And the sooner we can get on with that, the better.
Thanks, William. You've summed up this evening's discussion perfectly there. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to you, because I'm afraid that's all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland depends on the generosity of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes and to continue to develop the station. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of raising £30,000 in order that we can pay the bills. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. Now, we will be back on Sunday at 12 noon sharp for the next edition of the Full Scottish, so please come back and join us then. I'd like to thank everyone who has been watching this evening, and of course I'd like to give very special thanks to our very special guest, William Duguid. Thanks, William.
And thanks for having me. It's been fun again.
It's been an absolute pleasure, William. Thank you. On this day in 1307, Edward I of England died whilst on his way to try and subdue our new Scottish king, Robert the Bruce. And also on this day in 1928, in Chillicothe, Missouri, pre-sliced bread first went on sale. The loaves, baked by a local company, were cut using a machine designed by a man called Otto Rohwedder. I'm away to invent the Robert the Bruce sandwich. Please look after yourself and have a very peaceful weekend. Bye-bye.